The day began quietly, the kind of quiet she had learned to treasure. The soft hiss of the kettle, the hum of the old refrigerator, the tiny, deliberate sound of scissors trimming dead leaves from her roses. Each small sound felt like a stitch holding her world together. For years, this little house had been her haven, a modest, sunlit space filled with memories and silence. After her husband's passing, it had become her one safe place, where nothing changed unless she decided it would. She knelt by the flowerbed, brushing her palms on her apron, when she heard it, 3 sharp knocks. Not gentle, not uncertain, the kind of knock that doesn't ask to come in, it announces itself. She frowned, glancing at the gate. No one was due to visit, the mail had already come. For a fleeting moment she wondered if she had imagined it. But then came the second round, louder this time, impatient. Her hands felt damp as she rose, wiping soil from her fingers. The world outside her front door was something she rarely invited in these days. Still, she smoothed her hair, steadied her breath and opened it. There they were. David, her son, and Claire, his wife, both smiling in that strained, overly bright way that makes your stomach twist. Behind them, the unmistakable sight of a moving truck. For a moment, her mind couldn't catch up with her eyes. "Mom," David said, stepping forward to hug her before she could react. His voice was cheerful, rehearsed almost. Claire followed, holding a cardboard box marked "Kitchen Fragile." Her lips parted. "What's all this?" "Oh," Claire said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, "we thought it'd be best to move in for a while. You know, save money, help you out around the house." She blinked, words sticking in her throat. "Move in," she repeated softly. Her voice sounded smaller than she expected, like it belonged to someone else. Claire laughed, light and sharp. "Yes, isn't it perfect? We'll have our own space upstairs and you won't have to be alone all the time." She watched in stunned silence as David signaled to the movers. Within seconds, the men began unloading boxes, walking past her as though she were invisible, furniture legs bumping against her walls, dust swirling into her clean hallway. It didn't feel real. It felt like watching her life through glass, someone else's movie, someone else's house. Her garden gloves still clung to her fingers, damp with soil. She wanted to say stop, to tell them to wait, but the words never came. Instead, she smiled. That brittle, practiced smile mothers use when they know resistance will only make it worse. "Of course," she heard herself say, "you can settle in." Claire beamed, already calling instructions. "David, let's put the crib in the spare room. Oh, and the boxes marked office. Those can go in her study for now. We'll sort later." Her study. Her husband's old desk. The only room she never let anyone touch. Something twisted deep inside her chest, small, tight, dangerous, but she said nothing. The movers clattered down the hall, leaving scuff marks on the floor she had polished that morning. Claire's perfume filled the air, sweet, synthetic, suffocating. David smiled awkwardly. "It'll just be for a little while, Mom. You'll see it'll be nice having us around again." She nodded slowly, though her eyes never left the truck. Each box disappearing into her house felt like another piece of her solitude being packed away. By the time the last box crossed her threshold, her roses outside were already wilting in the afternoon sun, untended, forgotten. She stood in the doorway, clutching her apron, feeling the house grow smaller around her. Every laugh from Claire echoed through the hall, every scrape of a chair sounded like an intrusion. It wasn't just noise, it was possession. Her home, her quiet, was being colonized in real time, and she could do nothing but watch. David kissed her cheek, distracted. "You'll get used to it, Mom, it's just temporary." She forced another smile, though her stomach felt hollow. "Of course," she whispered, "temporary." As the truck engine faded down the street, she stood at the window. The late sunlight slanted across the living room, golden, beautiful, indifferent. Claire's laughter floated in from the kitchen, light and bright, like wind chimes made of glass. That's when it hit her, the smallest, sharpest truth. They hadn't asked to move in. They had decided. And she, without realizing, had just said yes. Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone on the counter. She didn't know who she meant to call, maybe her sister, maybe no one, but her fingers hovered there, motionless. Her reflection in the window stared back at her, smaller, older, fading. And in that hollow silence she knew something had shifted forever. Morning came quietly, but her house no longer felt like hers. It hummed with new sounds, drawers opening, furniture scraping, Claire's voice calling out from room to room. Every sound had an edge. David was already in the living room, sleeves rolled up, giving directions to no one in particular. "Claire, the couch looks better facing the window. Mom, don't you think?" She looked up from the teacup in her hand, the same cup she'd used every morning since her husband's passing. Her lips curved faintly. "It's fine where it is, dear." He smiled, not hearing her. "Yeah, I think it opens the space up." And just like that, the couch moved. Her couch, the one she and her husband had bought when they could barely afford it. The one where she used to nap during winter afternoons while he read the paper beside her. Now it was better facing the window. Claire clapped her hands softly. "Oh, much better, it was so cramped before, you'll thank us later." Her tone was light, but something inside it dismissed years of care in a single breath. The mother nodded, setting down her teacup before they could notice her trembling hand. She watched as Claire moved through the house like an interior designer on assignment, commenting, correcting, improving. "These curtains, they block too much light. This tablecloth, a bit old-fashioned, don't you think? Oh, we'll need to clear some of these shelves, too cluttered." Too cluttered. Every object on those shelves had a story. Her husband's favorite fishing mug. David's clay dinosaur from second grade. The clock that stopped ticking the week after the funeral, but she couldn't bring herself to fix it. Each thing held a heartbeat. Now, one by one, those heartbeats were being silenced. David took her silence as permission. "Mom, I'll handle the garage. You don't need to worry about it anymore." Handle, as if she were a guest in her own life. She nodded again because that's what she'd always done, nodded, smiled, softened the edges for everyone else. But inside, something small began to unravel. As she dusted the picture frames in the hallway later that morning, her mind wandered to a time when the house had been full of warmth, not noise. Her husband's laughter had always filled the space like sunlight. He had been patient, steady, the kind of man who fixed things quietly without being asked. When he died, the silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, unending. David had drifted away after that, new city, new job, new wife. Claire had arrived like a storm dressed in silk, polite, bright, but always correcting her. "David doesn't like too much sugar in his tea, Mrs. Walsh. Maybe you should rest, let us handle dinner. Your home is so cozy, like a time capsule." A time capsule, that word had strung. For years she had stayed quiet, not because she was weak, but because she was tired of fighting to be heard. She had told herself that love meant patience, that family meant compromise. Now, as Claire rearranged her living room, she wondered what all that patience had cost her. By afternoon, the house looked different. The furniture had been shifted, the photographs reorganized. Claire's potted plants, bright, glossy things with no scent, replaced the faded carnations on the window sill. David stood proudly in the center of it all. "There," he said, "feels like new." She looked around, it didn't feel new. It felt erased. Claire slipped an arm through David's. "We'll make it feel more like home for everyone." Everyone. The word sat heavy in the air. She retreated to the kitchen, her sanctuary, or what was left of it. The smell of morning tea still lingered, faint but comforting. She touched the counter, the worn wood cool beneath her fingers. This was where her husband used to sit, newspaper folded, teasing her about overcooked eggs. His photo always stood near the spice rack, smiling, gentle, eternal. She glanced at the spot out of habit and froze. It was empty. Her breath hitched. She looked around the counter, the shelves, the windowsill, nothing. The space where his picture had been was bare, wiped clean. "Claire," she called, her voice sharp for the first time that day. "Yes," came the cheerful reply from the living room. "Did you move something from the kitchen? A photo?" "Oh, that," Claire laughed, walking in with a dish rag over her shoulder. "I put it in the drawer with the rest of the old stuff, thought it cluttered the counter." She stared at her daughter-in-law, words forming, then dying before they reached her tongue. Old stuff. The phrase echoed in her mind like a verdict. Her husband's face, the man who built this house, who loved every inch of it, now reduced to old stuff. Her throat tightened. He belongs there," she whispered. Claire shrugged. We can always take it out later. For now, let's keep things clean, okay? David appeared in the doorway, smiling the same way he did as a child when he wanted peace. Mom, Claire's just helping, don't make a fuss. Don't make a fuss. She nodded slowly, stepping aside as they continued talking, but her eyes never left that empty spot. The counter looked wrong, too bright, too polished, too quiet. A strange feeling crawled up her spine, something between grief and fury. She went to her room and closed the door softly behind her. For the first time in years, she wished the silence would go away. There was a time when Claire's laughter had filled this same house with light. Not the harsh, cold kind of light it carried now, but soft, warm, inviting. The first time she met Claire, the young woman had worn a butter-yellow dress and carried a pie she hadn't baked. She'd smiled like she meant it. "Mrs. Walsh, I've heard so much about you," she'd said, eyes shining. "David told me you make the best stew in the world." The mother had laughed, really laughed. "He exaggerates, dear, but I'll make it for you next time." Claire had leaned in to hug her. "I'd love that." And for a moment, she'd believed this was the daughter she'd never had. Back then, every phone call from David came with a cheerful interruption in the background. "Say hi to your mom. Tell her we're planning to visit soon." When they came, Claire always brought flowers. She'd compliment the house, help set the table, and ask for recipes she never planned to cook. The mother noticed small things, how Claire never ate much, but always commented on what others did. "How do you stay so thin, Mrs. Walsh? I'd gain a pound just smelling your bread." She laughed politely, not realizing that beneath the humor was a quiet cut. A reminder that she was agging, soft, replaceable. Still, she tried to see the good. "David's happy," she told herself. "That's all that matters." It began slowly. First, Claire started answering David's phone for him. When she called to check in, it was always Claire who picked up. "Oh, David's busy right now, work, you know how it is, but I'll tell him you called." Days turned into weeks. Sometimes the calls weren't returned at all. When she finally spoke to David, his tone was different, distracted, polite, distant. He'd say things like, "Mom, you worry too much. Claire says I need to set boundaries, make space for our own family." Our own family. The phrase hit her like a quiet door closing. But she didn't argue, she didn't want to be the mother who interferes. So she cooked quietly for one, and told herself that love meant giving space, even when that space began to feel like exile. The next visit came 6 months later. Claire walked in with that same perfect smile, but the warmth had cooled. She looked around the house, her eyes scanning like a camera lens. "Oh, you haven't changed a thing," she said brightly. "It's nostalgic." The word strung, though it was dressed in sweetness. When David went to fix the leaky faucet, Claire sat at the table, folding her hands elegantly. "You must miss him terribly," she said, her voice soft. "Your husband." The mother nodded. "Every day." Claire tilted her head. "I can't imagine, but you're strong, you've raised such a good man." She smiled, and for a moment the mother felt warmth again. Then Claire added gently, "Of course, I've had to help him unlearn some of the habits he picked up here." The words were sugar-coated poison. "What do you mean, dear?" she asked carefully. "Oh, just little things, how he never says what he wants, how he apologizes too quickly, how he avoids conflict. I tell him it's because he grew up trying not to upset anyone." The mother froze. "He was always kind." Claire smiled wider. "Exactly, kind, not assertive, but don't worry, he's learning." There it was again, that careful shift. A compliment turned blade. A kindness repackaged as weakness. The mother said nothing. She simply poured more tea and watched the steam rise between them like a fog. Over the years, Claire perfected her image. To everyone else, she was a saint, thoughtful, giving. Patient. She remembered birthdays, sent gifts, smiled in photographs. But beneath that veneer of grace, she drew boundaries like walls. When the mother offered to visit, there was always a reason she couldn't. The apartment's too small. David's working late. I'm not feeling well. Yet on social media, there they were, smiling at parties, traveling, living a life that didn't seem to have room for her. She began to shrink her world to fit what remained: her garden, her morning tea, her husband's memory. But she never stopped hopping, mothers never do. So when the knock came that day, and she saw them standing at her door, part of her still wanted to believe it was a homecoming. That maybe, finally, her family had returned to her. But now, as boxes filled her hallway and her husband's picture was tucked away like clutter, she realized the truth. Clea hadn't come home. She'd come to take it. That night, unable to sleep, the mother sat at her kitchen table with the one photograph Clea hadn't found yet. A small one, tucked behind a cookbook. In it, her husband had his arm around her, smiling that same quiet smile that said everything will be fine. She traced his face with a shaking finger. "I tried," she whispered, "I really tried." In her mind, she replayed every warning sign she had ignored. Every time Claire had spoken sweetly but meant something else. Every time David had laughed off her concerns, saying, "She didn't mean it like that, Mom." Maybe she hadn't wanted to believe it. Maybe love had made her blind, not the kind of love that gives, but the kind that fears losing. The next morning she watched Claire in the kitchen, her kitchen, rearranging spices and humming softly. There was grace in every movement, precision in every gesture. Claire turned, smiling. "I made breakfast, thought I'd give you a break." Her voice was honey, smooth, golden, heavy. The mother looked at the table. Her own plates, her husband's old napkin folded under Claire's coffee mug. A strange ache filled her chest, the kind that comes from seeing something sacred used carelessly. She smiled back. "You're very thoughtful, dear." Claire's eyes softened. "We're family after all." The words sounded warm, but all the mother could think was how Claire said we, and how that we never seemed to include her. Later that afternoon, as she stood at the window watching the garden sway in the wind, she realized something profound. Claire wasn't cruel, at least not in the way cruelty is usually shown. She didn't shout, she didn't break things. She smiled, she reasoned, she wrapped every wound in silk. It wasn't destruction, it was control painted to look like care. And the saddest part, for years she had mistaken that control for kindness. She turned from the window, looking around her home one last time. The furniture was rearranged. The photos tucked away. Her husband's presence fading. She exhaled slowly, and for the first time allowed herself to name what she'd refused to see. "I used to think Claire wanted a family, but she wanted an empire." Was a time when silence had been her safest place. Not out of fear, but survival. From the moment she married Richard Walsh, she learned that peace in a home wasn't something that simply existed, it was something you maintained, like a delicate vase balanced on a high shelf. One wrong word, one sharp tone, and everything could crack. Richard wasn't unkind. He was stern, quiet, deliberate, the kind of man who didn't raise his voice, but whose disappointment could fill an entire room. He believed in order, in calm, in keeping things civil. And she believed in him. So when he came home after long days and wanted silence, she gave it. When he brushed off her opinions with a smile, "You worry too much, Margaret," she laughed and agreed. She learned early that love sometimes meant choosing not to speak. It was easier that way. When David was born, that silence became devotion. She poured herself into motherhood with quiet precision. Late nights, endless patience, soft songs that no one else ever heard. She wanted David to grow up in peace, to never feel the tremors she'd felt as a girl in a house where her father's temper cracked through walls. Her own mother had taught her a rule she never forgot. When a man shouts, you hold your ground in silence. Words are wind, quiet is stone. So she built her life from stone. She learned how to comfort without confrontation, how to endure without resentment. When her husband made decisions she didn't agree with, which friends to keep, which jobs to refuse, how to spend their savings, she would nod and tell herself, "It's not worth the fight." When neighbors whispered that she was too soft, she smiled, because she knew softness didn't mean surrender. It meant she could absorb the world's noise and still stand. But after Richard died, that silence became something else entirely. For the first time, there was no one to maintain peace for. The house echoed differently. The clock ticked louder. The nights stretched longer. And she realized she didn't even know what her voice sounded like anymore. Still, she didn't mind the quiet, it was hers now. Her garden, her home, her small routines, they were the rhythm she'd built from decades of quiet service. Until they came back. David had always loved his father. He admired him, the firmness, the confidence, the authority. But he'd inherited something from his mother too, the instinct to please. So when he married Claire, with her clear opinions and polished charm, she saw her son's gentleness bend. At first she thought it was balance. Then she realized it was erasure. Every time she tried to speak to him, Claire's words filled the space first. David's busy. David agrees with me. David thinks you should rest more. Her son stopped finishing his sentences, because Claire had learned to finish them for him. And she let it happen. Why? Because she believed that one day he'd notice the difference, that he'd see who was speaking and who was silent. But that day never came. Now, standing in her own kitchen as Claire wiped the counters she had cleaned 1,000 times before, she realized something new. Her silence was no longer protecting peace. It was protecting them. Protecting their comfort. Their control. Their illusion that she was too kind to resist. She looked at David that evening as he carried another box in unasked, uninvited, and something inside her shifted. He looked so much like his father when he worked, focused, assured, sure of his purpose. And yet there was something else, a softness that had hardened. Mom, he said, barely glancing at her, Claire thinks it's better if we take the guest room for now. You can move into yours, we'll make sure you still have your space. Your space. The phrase hit like a slap. Her house, her walls, her life. And yet somehow she was being given a space in it. She didn't respond. She simply nodded, as she always had. But inside, something ancient began to stir. That night, she sat at her husband's old desk, the one still marked with scratches from when David did his homework, and opened the small wooden box she hadn't touched in years. Inside were small mementos, a faded photo, a church program, a pressed flower, and a letter. Richard's handwriting. She unfolded it carefully, tracing each word like a prayer. Maggie, you've always been the heart of this family. I know you think your kindness is what keeps us steady, and it is. But promise me something, don't let anyone take your kindness for weakness. The world needs women like you, but only if they remember they have a voice. She had read those words 100 times before. But tonight they felt different. Not like comfort, like instruction. She looked around at the house she'd built with those hands, the same hands that had planted every rose, folded every blanket, wiped every tear. This was not just her home. It was her proof. Proof that silence wasn't surrender, it was discipline. And discipline, when tested, could become power. In the morning, she spoke little. She let Claire make plans, let David rearrange shelves. She smiled when Claire asked about removing some of the old things to brighten up the place. Let them think she was agreeable. Let them underestimate her. She brewed tea carefully, precisely, the way Richard used to like it. As she poured it, she whispered to herself, "Don't let anyone take your kindness for weakness." The words felt heavier now. Real. Alive. That evening she stood by the window, looking at the dark outline of the moving truck parked outside. In the reflection, she saw her own face, older, yes, but sharper than she remembered. She thought of all the times she'd swallowed her truth for peace. Of how easily people mistook silence for surrender. Of how easily she had helped them believe it. A slow, knowing smile curved her lips. They thought she wouldn't resist. They thought she wouldn't speak. They thought she didn't know how. But they'd forgotten, silence isn't the absence of power. It's where power waits. And as she turned off the kitchen light that night, her reflection vanished into the darkness. But her voice, the one she hadn't used in years, finally whispered back. I'd spent years learning to stay quiet. Now they'd learn what silence can do. By the third day, her house no longer smelled like home. It smelled like Claire's citrus-scented cleaner, sharp, synthetic, invasive. The scent clung to everything, the curtains, the counters, even her clothes. It was the smell of someone else's order pressing down on her life. The guest room, once warm and full of family photos, now stood stripped and sterile. Boxes labelled Claire's work stuff leaned against the wall. Her sewing machine had been pushed into the hallway like an unwanted guest. Claire stood in the doorway, hands on her hips, the faintest smile playing on her lips. "I'll be needing this room for my office," she said. "You know how noisy the living room can get when David's on calls. It'll be better for all of us." Better for all of us. The words hung in the air like perfume, sweet, polite, and entirely poisonous. Margaret, though no one called her that anymore, not even her son, nodded. "Of course, dear," she murmured, her tone gentle, her eyes soft. Her hands, however, trembled slightly as she folded the linen from the guest bed. Each motion was deliberate, careful, measured, not because she was fragile but because she needed to think. Every movement now had meaning. She carried the sheets to her own room, the one they'd generously let her keep, and sat down on the edge of the bed, the same spot where she used to read bedtime stories to David. Outside her door, she heard the sound of hammering, Claire's laughter, David's footsteps, the thump of new shelves being installed. Every sound was an intrusion. Every laugh a reminder. Her house was being rewritten, piece by piece, as though her life were a draft they could edit. By the end of the week, the kitchen cabinets were rearranged. Claire had labelled them pasta, cereal, herbal teas, as though Margaret might forget. Her floral teacups had been moved to the top shelf, replaced by Claire's glass mugs. The old oak table Richard had built himself was now covered with a plastic protector. When she tried to make tea one morning, Claire smiled and said, "Oh, don't worry, I already brewed some green tea for you. You'll feel lighter if you drink that instead of your usual stuff." Margaret smiled back, how thoughtful. But her eyes stayed on the cabinet handle that used to squeak, now fixed, oiled, silent. Just like her. David was no better. He'd begun locking the garage, her garage. She asked once softly, "Why the lock, sweetheart?" He smiled awkwardly. "Just some of my tools and important documents in there, Mom. Don't worry, it's safer this way." Safer from what, she wondered. Safer from whom? She watched him pull the chain across the door, the metallic click echoing in her chest. Every sound in that house now felt like a claim, a declaration that her ownership, her life, her memories were being quietly overwritten. That evening they all sat at dinner together, a tableau of false harmony. Claire's voice carried over the sound of silverware. "Once we settle in, we can start making bigger changes. Maybe open up the kitchen wall. It'll make the house feel more modern." David nodded eagerly. "Yeah, we could easily refinance and get the work done before winter." Margaret froze, her fork hovering midair. Refinance. Her fingers twitched. That word wasn't small talk, it was strategy. Claire looked at David with that familiar, soft manipulation in her smile. "It'll be our home, David. Finally a space that feels truly ours. I mean, your mom will love the changes too, right?" Her tone was sugar. Her intent was acid. Margaret smiled faintly. "I'm sure I'll learn to love it." Later that night, the voices came again, faint, behind the door of the office. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but when your name becomes a whisper in your own home, silence turns into armor. Claire's voice was low, precise. "She's old, David, she won't fight it. Once it's legally convenient, we can sell and move closer to the city. Think of it, a down payment on our own place." David hesitated. "But it's her house." "Ours," Claire interrupted softly. "You're her only child. It'll all be yours soon anyway, we're just getting a head start." There was a pause. Then David sighed. "Yes, you're probably right." The mother's hand tightened around the doorknob, then released it. She turned, walked back to her room and closed her door quietly. No tears. No trembling. Just a deep, steady calm, the kind that comes before a storm. For hours she sat in silence, the clock ticking beside her. The house, her house, hummed with the faint electricity of betrayal. She could hear them moving around, laughing softly. The sound had once filled her with warmth, now it hollowed her out. On the dresser beside her bed sat a photo of Richard holding baby David, smiling under the summer sun. Her fingers brushed the frame. Your son, she whispered, has your stubbornness, but not your honor. The moonlight caught the faint shimmer of dust on the frame. Something in her eyes hardened. When the house finally went still, she rose. Her feet were silent on the wood floor. She knew every board that creaked, every spot that didn't. She moved toward the old writing desk in her room, the same one where she had once balanced the family checkbook, signed every school permission slip, and paid every bill. Her hand slid into the bottom drawer. Behind the stack of envelopes under the old lace tablecloth was a single manila folder. She pulled it out slowly, dust rising in the pale light. Inside were yellowing pages, embossed, notarized, precise. Property ownership, Margaret Walsh. Every page bore her name. Her signature. Her seal. Not his. Not theirs. Hers. She spread the documents neatly across the desk, smoothing the corners with care. Each paper was a quiet rebellion, a declaration of truth. She sat back, the faintest smile curling her lips. They thought she was powerless because she was quiet. Because she cooked, cleaned, and smiled when spoken to. Because she played the part of the harmless old woman. But power doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it hides in plain sight. In the living room, the wind rattled the window. Clea stirred in her sleep down the hall. David's phone buzzed with another late-night notification. The world moved as usual, unaware that something fundamental had shifted. Because at that desk, in that moment, Margaret wasn't the victim anymore. She was the author. And the story wasn't over. Her eyes lingered on the bold black ink of her name. Then she whispered to the quiet room, words no one else would hear until it was far too late. They thought I was powerless. They forgot whose name was still on the deed. Next morning arrived in deceptive calm, sunlight spilling through lace curtains, birdsong mingling with the faint hum of the refrigerator. To anyone looking in from the outside, it was an ordinary day. But inside Margaret's chest, something had shifted, a click, a lock, a quiet decision that could not be undone. She stood in the kitchen, stirring her tea in slow, unhurried circles. Clea's laughter drifted faintly from the hallway, the sound of a woman who believed she had already won. David's voice followed, warm, complacent, familiar. Margaret took one slow sip and set the cup down. Then she reached for the phone. It wasn't a trembling hand that lifted it this time. It was steady, deliberate. For months she had said nothing, smiled, cooked, watched. But silence, she had learned, was not the same as surrender. Her fingers dialed a number she had memorized long ago, the one she never thought she'd need again. 3 rings. Then a familiar voice answered, warm and professional. Good morning, this is Henson and Clark Associates. How can I help you? Margaret's voice was soft, almost serene. Good morning, Anna, this is Margaret Walsh. I need to speak to Mr. Henson, it's urgent. A pause, then. Of course, Mrs. Walsh, 1 moment please. The line clicked. She could hear faint typing, the shuffle of papers, and then a voice she hadn't heard in years, calm, composed, reliable. Margaret, it's been a while, how are you holding up? She took a slow breath. I'm ready to make some changes, Paul, effective immediately. He hesitated. Changes to what exactly? Margaret glanced toward the hallway. Clea's voice carried, cheerful, controlling. David, could you move those boxes from the garage to the dining room? We'll need the space for the renovation plans. Her grip on the receiver tightened, not from anger but focus. My home, she said. The title, the will, everything, I want it locked down, legally airtight. No transfers, no access, no refinancing without my consent. And draft an eviction clause for unauthorized occupants. There was a quiet whistle on the other end. Margaret, that's a serious step, are you sure? Her tone didn't waver. Quite sure. He paused again, softer now. This about your son. She swallowed, it's about my dignity. While he took notes, she stared out the kitchen window. Her garden looked smaller now, crushed tulips where the movers had stepped, the earth still wounded from their arrival. But even among the trampled flowers, a few stems had risen back toward the light. She smiled faintly. You'll handle it quietly. Always, Henson replied. I'll have the documents ready for your signature by tomorrow morning. Should I bring them myself? Yes, she said, and Paul. Yes. Make sure it's written clearly, they are guests here, not owners. When she hung up, the sound was almost musical, a soft, definitive click that seemed to echo through the entire house. She placed the phone down on the counter, aligning it perfectly with the placemat. Every detail mattered now. The call had taken less than 6 minutes, but those 6 minutes changed everything. Claire appeared in the doorway mid-sentence. Margaret, I was just saying to David, maybe we can. She stopped when she saw her. Margaret's expression was unreadable, not angry, not sad, just composed. Yes, Claire, she said gently. Oh, nothing, I was just thinking we could clear out that old cabinet in your room. It'd make more space for storage. Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. That cabinet's older than this house. Some things aren't meant to be moved. Claire gave a small laugh, brushing it off, but for the first time something flickered in her gaze, a hint of confusion. As the day wore on, Margaret went about her routine as if nothing had happened. She baked, she dusted, she listened to Claire's endless chatter about modern updates. But every movement was now part of a quiet orchestration, an invisible performance for an audience that didn't yet know the show was over. At one point, David entered the kitchen, glancing at her with mild guilt. Mom, I hope you're okay with everything. Claire just wants to help you manage things better, that's all. Her tone was gentle, measured. I know, sweetheart, I'm grateful you're both here, for now. He frowned slightly, for now. She smiled, handing him a plate of cookies. Everything in life is temporary, David, you'll understand someday. That evening, when the house quieted and the lights dimmed, she sat again at her writing desk. The documents still lay there, the proof of ownership, the paper that carried her life's work in neat black ink. But now, beside it, she placed a small notepad. On it, she wrote a list. Call Mr. Henson tomorrow at 9 a.m. Change bank access. Lock the filing cabinet. Move Richard's photo back to the mantel. She underlined the last one twice. Then, with the faintest trace of irony, she added a fifth line. Smile. Outside, rain began to fall, gentle at first, then steady. She could hear it pattering on the windows, washing away the dust from the day. It sounded like cleansing, like release. In her mind, she replayed her husband's voice, don't let anyone take your kindness for weakness. She had obeyed those words in silence for years. Now she was honoring them with action. Claire's door creaked somewhere down the hall. Margaret didn't move, she didn't hide the papers, didn't flinch. Let them see if they dared look. Her reflection in the darkened window looked different. Steadier, sharper. Almost unfamiliar. The woman who once bit her tongue now held the pen that could erase them from her home. As the clock struck 10, she reached for her tea again, now cold, untouched. The world outside was hushed, rain whispering against the glass. She looked at the phone one last time. By the time I set down the phone, she murmured to the quiet room. I already knew they'd never see this coming. Came like a courtroom summons, sharp, deliberate, merciless. The air felt different that day. No birdsong, no warmth, only the low growl of a moving truck's idle engine outside, left from the night before. Margaret rose before dawn. She dressed not in her usual cardigan and slippers, but in a neat, pale blue blouse and pressed trousers. Her hair was pinned, her face calm, not soft. By 9:00 a.m. the doorbell rang. Claire was at the dining table, sipping coffee from one of Margaret's heirloom cups. The ones she'd once said were too old-fashioned. She didn't even look up, expecting someone. Margaret smiled faintly, yes. When she opened the door, Paul Henson stood there, tall, silver-haired, briefcase in hand. His presence carried the weight of order, the kind of authority that didn't need to shout to be obeyed. Mrs. Walsh, he greeted, his tone polite but purposeful. Everything prepared just as you requested. Claire's head snapped up. Everything, she repeated, rising from her chair. Paul gave her a polite nod, the kind one reserves for strangers. I'm Mr. Henson, Mrs. Walsh's attorney. I'll just need her signature on a few documents. David emerged from the hallway, shirt half buttoned. What's going on, Mom? Margaret gestured toward the living room. Why don't you both sit down? It'll be easier to explain. The tension in the room was a living thing. Paul opened his briefcase, laying out several crisp documents. His voice remained calm, professional. Per Mrs. Walsh's direction, ownership of this property has been transferred into a living trust under her exclusive control. This means any attempt to sell, lease, or refinance the home without her written consent will be legally void. Claire's eyebrows shot up. What, you can't just… Paul continued, unbothered. Additionally, under current housing regulations, Mrs. Walsh is entitled to request temporary vacancy for major renovations or safety inspections. Therefore, he slid 2 white envelopes across the coffee table. These are formal notices to vacate the premises within 15 days. Silence. The clock ticked 3 times before Claire found her voice. This is ridiculous. You can't evict your own family. Margaret's tone was level. No, I can't, but the trust can. David's face drained of colour. Mom, you wouldn't do this. We just needed some time. She looked at him, really looked, at the man she had raised, now a stranger in her home. Her voice was soft, but every word landed like a gavel. You moved in without asking. Now you'll have to move out by law. Claire laughed, brittle, incredulous. This is a bluff, you wouldn't dare. Paul began gathering his papers. Mrs. Walsh's decision is entirely legal. I can send confirmation from the county office within the hour if you'd like. Claire's face twitched, the smile faltering, then returning thinner. We'll see about that. David, say something. David's voice cracked. Claire, please, not now. Not now, she hissed. She's throwing us out. But Margaret didn't respond. She simply took the signed documents, placed them neatly in a folder and stood. The years of silence had been armor, but this moment this was her sword. Paul packed up and left shortly after, his car disappearing down the quiet street. Inside, the air felt charged, like the seconds before a storm breaks. Claire followed Margaret into the kitchen, her voice cold. You think you've won, don't you? That little stunt won't last. David's your son, he'll talk you out of it. Margaret wiped the counter, unhurried. You've mistaken my kindness for permission, she said evenly. That was your first mistake. And the second, Claire shot back. Margaret turned, meeting her eyes, assuming I was alone. She nodded toward the front porch. Across the street, a man in a city maintenance vest was photographing the property, the first of several scheduled inspections Paul had arranged to justify the legal notice. Everything was already in motion. Claire's lips parted, but no sound came. You planned this, she whispered. You've been planning this. Margaret smiled faintly. I learned from the best. You taught me how to think 3 moves ahead. Later, David stood by the window, his shoulders slumped. Mom, I never meant for it to go this far. Claire just thought. I know what she thought, Margaret interrupted gently, and I know what you allowed. He turned to her, voice breaking. We were struggling. I thought maybe if we stayed here for a bit. You could rebuild, she finished softly, at the cost of my peace. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to defend. Evening settled. The house was silent except for the ticking clock, steady, certain. Claire packed noisily in the guest room, muttering under her breath. David lingered in the doorway, guilt etched across his face. Margaret sat at her desk again, pen in hand, writing in her diary not with bitterness but clarity. Love doesn't mean surrender, she wrote. And motherhood isn't servitude. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for your child is remind them who taught them strength. At dinner, the table was strangely quiet. Claire didn't speak, David barely ate. Margaret set down her fork and looked at them both, not as enemies, but as lessons. I'm not angry, she said, I'm simply done. David looked up, eyes wet. Done with us? No, she said softly, done being small so others can feel big. Her words hung in the air like a verdict. When Claire finally rose from the table, her face had changed. The practiced smile, the social grace, the false warmth, all of it cracked, fell away. For the first time since she'd entered Margaret's life, there was no pretense left. Just raw disbelief. You'll regret this, she said quietly. Margaret met her gaze, Perhaps, but at least it'll be my regret, not yours. As they retreated to their room, the old house seemed to exhale. For the first time in weeks, it felt like itself again, still grounded hers. Margaret walked to the mantel and lifted her husband's photo, placing it gently back where it belonged. She whispered to the frame, voice steady. "Checkmate, Richard, just like you taught me." By the following week, the entire neighborhood knew. Not through Margaret, she hadn't said a word, but through the walls that carried whispers, the fences that shared glances, and the quiet observation that the once smiling couple next door were now packing in tense silence. The moving truck returned, not triumphant this time but heavy with shame. Clea stood outside on the front lawn, barking orders into her phone. "Just make sure the boxes labeled office go in first. No, not the kitchen stuff, the office." Her voice was brittle, desperate, the tone of someone trying to maintain control over a life slipping through their fingers. From her window, Margaret watched, not out of malice but closure. She didn't smirk, she didn't revel. She simply observed the storm she'd weathered finally move on. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, appeared by the mailbox pretending to collect letters. "Oh dear," she murmured, "trouble in paradise." Margaret smiled faintly, something like that. Within hours, whispers rippled through the neighborhood like wind through dry leaves. "Did you hear? Her son and his wife tried to take over her home." "That sweet woman, no way. I saw her the other day, still tending her roses like nothing happened. Graceful, that one. But it didn't stop at the fence line." Someone, perhaps a friend, perhaps Karma, had shared Clea's now deleted social media posts. Staged selfies in her new home, captions bragging about finally taking charge. The comments turned cold. "Wasn't that your husband's mother's house? Not very classy, Clea. You really tried to take her home, yikes." Clea watched her perfect online image crumble. Her followers, the same ones who once praised her family values, now questioned her character. She tried to fight back with explanations. "It's complicated. Don't believe everything you hear. But the internet has no mercy for those who built empires on illusion." By the next day, her account went private. At David's office, things were quieter but not easier. A coworker approached him by the coffee machine, voice low but sympathetic. "Heard things got rough at home. Must have been hard for your mom." David didn't respond. He just nodded, his reflection in the steel machine looking older, smaller. Word had spread there too, but differently. People spoke of his mother with admiration. "Strong woman." Didn't even raise her voice, just handled it with dignity. "Wish more people were like that." David realized, perhaps for the first time, that the strength he'd taken for granted, the quiet endurance he'd dismissed as passive, was the very thing that commanded respect. That evening, Margaret received a letter slipped under her door. No name, just neat handwriting. "You remind me of my own mother. Thank you for standing up for yourself and for all of us who never did." She read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in her husband's old desk drawer. Her silence had become a statement, one that traveled further than any speech could. A few days later, as Clea loaded the last of the boxes into the truck, the air was heavy with unspoken defeat. David lingered on the porch, eyes downcast. "I didn't mean for things to end like this," he said softly. Margaret nodded. "Endings aren't always bad, David, some are just overdue." He looked at her, shame flickering across his face. "People are talking." "Let them," she replied simply. "Truth doesn't need defending." That night, the neighborhood lights dimmed one by one. Margaret sat in her garden, surrounded by the hum of crickets and the faint scent of jasmine. Her phone buzzed, a message from an old friend she hadn't heard from in years. "Saw what happened, Maggie. You handled it like a queen. The world needs women like you." Margaret smiled, tears pricking at her eyes not from sadness but from relief. For so long, she had believed silence was surrender. Now she understood. Silence could also be power, sharp, deliberate, unshakable. The next morning, as she watered her roses, Clea's car pulled out of the driveway for the last time. No waves, no words, just the quiet sound of departure. Mrs. Patterson appeared again, clutching her teacup. "Leaving already?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, the house feels lighter, doesn't it?" Mrs. Patterson smiled. "Oh, it does, dear, it really does." Inside, the walls seemed to breathe again, free from tension, from pretense. The photo of her late husband caught the morning light just right, and for the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself to laugh softly, joyfully. Her peace wasn't loud or dramatic, it was steady, earned, and deeply hers. The morning air was crisp, the kind that carries endings on its breath. Margaret stood on the porch, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, as the moving truck rumbled back into her driveway, the same one that had arrived weeks ago, full of confidence and entitlement. Now it looked heavier, not with furniture but with the weight of defeat. Claire was giving orders again, though her voice trembled. "Be careful with that box, it's fragile." She snapped at the movers, her words cracking like glass. Her perfect composure had shattered, her hair unbrushed, her eyes ringed in exhaustion. The woman who once treated Margaret's house like her empire now avoided even looking at the front door. David stood by the fence, hands in his pockets, staring at the ground. The yard, once cluttered with their boxes and laughter, felt strange, almost peaceful again. Margaret noticed her roses trembling in the morning breeze, droplets of dew glistening like quiet applause. No shouting. No footsteps echoing down her hallway. Just stillness, honest, sacred stillness. Claire brushed past her on the porch without a word. Their shoulders nearly touched, but Margaret didn't move an inch. She didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. Inside the truck, boxes labeled office, David's clothes, and kitchen fragile were stacked carelessly. Margaret watched as one of the movers sealed the last flap with duct tape, the same tape she'd heard weeks ago when they'd claimed her living room. This time it was the sound of closure. David approached slowly, his movements hesitant, as if walking through memory. "Mom," he began, voice low, "I just wanted to say I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Margaret looked at him, really looked. The little boy who used to run into her arms after school was still in there, buried under years of someone else's influence. She smiled softly. "I know you didn't, David." He nodded, guilt clouding his face. Claire thought it would be easier if... She stopped him with a small gesture. "You don't need to explain, son. You just need to remember who you were before all this." For the first time, David met her eyes. There was shame, but also something new, the faint flicker of awakening. Claire's voice cut through the air again. "David, let's go." Her tone was sharp, but it carried fear. The mask was gone, all that remained was panic wrapped in pride. She climbed into the truck, slamming the door harder than necessary. Margaret didn't flinch. As the truck engine started, she felt the vibration under her feet, the same ground that had carried generations of her family, the home she and her late husband had built with calloused hands and quiet dreams. The vehicle pulled forward slowly. David stood there for a moment, torn between two worlds, then finally climbed in beside Claire. Margaret stayed on the porch, her hand resting on the old wooden railing. Every sound seemed louder, the crunch of gravel, the groan of the truck's gears, the fading hum as it turned the corner and disappeared down the street. And then, just like that, it was gone. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was whole. She took a deep breath, the kind she hadn't been able to take in months. The scent of roses drifted up from the garden, her husband's favorites. She whispered softly into the wind, her voice trembling with love, loss, and quiet triumph. "Goodbye, my son. Find the man you were before she made you forget." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Some tears lived too deep to fall. Inside, the house looked almost untouched, as if reclaiming itself. The sun broke through the curtains, landing on the old family photo she'd placed back on the kitchen shelf. Her husband, and a young David, smiling without weight. She traced her finger across the frame. "We're home again," she whispered. The kettle began to whistle. Margaret poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the garden sway gently in the morning light. Justice had been done, quietly. Gracefully, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like peace. The house was quiet again. But it wasn't the same kind of quiet that had haunted Margaret before, that heavy, suffocating stillness of being unseen. This quiet was lighter, gentler. It carried warmth, not loneliness. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, spilling golden ribbons across the floor. Dust motes danced in the light, and for the first time in months, Margaret didn't see them as signs of neglect, but of life. Real, peaceful life. She poured herself a cup of tea, the same way she always did, 2 sugars, no milk, and smiled at how sacred the ordinary had become. The first few days after David and Claire left, she moved through the house slowly, not out of fatigue but reverence. Every step was deliberate, a quiet reclaiming. In the living room, she opened the curtains that had stayed shut under Claire's modern aesthetic. Sunlight washed the walls, revealing the soft yellow she, once chosen with her husband. She whispered, "There you are," as though greeting an old friend. Then she found his photo, the one that had disappeared weeks ago, tucked behind a stack of Claire's unused Dacre books. She dusted the frame with trembling hands and set it back on the mantel, right where it belonged. "You'd be proud of me, John," she murmured. "I finally learned how to say no without ever raising my voice." Her days became rituals of quiet rebuilding. She repotted her roses, pruning, watering, whispering to them as she always had. The garden was her church, her sanctuary, her proof that life could bloom again after ruin. Neighbours began stopping by, curious at first, then admiring. Mrs. Patterson was the first. She arrived one sunny morning holding a bouquet of daisies. "I just wanted to say," she began, her voice cracking, "we all heard what happened. And you inspired us, dear, truly." Margaret blinked, touched but slightly embarrassed. "I didn't do anything special." Mrs. Patterson smiled. "That's just it. You didn't shout, you didn't fight, you simply stood your ground. Not many can do that anymore." The two women sat in the garden, sipping tea as bees hummed lazily between the roses. Margaret realized how starved she'd been for this, real companionship, born not of obligation but respect. That evening she went through the house one last time, setting things right. In the guest room, Claire's office, she opened the windows and let the stale air drift away. The scent of roses floated in, washing the space clean. She replaced the sterile desk lamp with a vase of fresh flowers. On the nightstand she placed a framed quote she once loved but forgotten. "Peace is not the absence of chaos, but the presence of self." She stood there a long moment, breathing deeply, letting the meaning settle. This was her home again, but more than that, this was her life again. Days turned into weeks. David called once, just once. His voice was hesitant, softer than she remembered. "Mom, I'm sorry, you didn't deserve any of that." She listened quietly, heart tight with both pain and relief. "I know, son, I know." There was a pause. "Claire, gone to stay with her parents for a while, I'm trying to figure things out." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Good, sometimes distance helps you remember who you are." Before hanging up, she added gently, "Just promise me one thing, David, next time you choose a home, make sure it's one where you're allowed to stay yourself." He said nothing, but she heard his quiet breath, the kind that carries both gratitude and regret. When the call ended, Margaret stood by the window, staring at the empty driveway. She didn't cry. She did ache. She simply felt a quiet, powerful peace. One afternoon, as she sat trimming her rose bushes, a knock echoed from the front door. Her heart skipped. The last time she'd heard that sound, it had brought chaos. But this time it felt different. She opened the door to find a young neighbor, a girl in her 20s, holding a potted plant. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes shy. "Hi, Mrs. Hughes, I just wanted to thank you," the girl stammered. "My mom told me what you did. You made me realize I've been letting people walk all over me too." Margaret smiled, surprised. "Oh dear, I didn't mean to teach anyone anything." The girl shook her head, pressing the plant into her hands. "You didn't mean to, but you did, thank you." As the girl walked away, Margaret stood there in the doorway, holding the small plant, a young jasmine, fragile but fragrant. She placed it beside her husband's photo, the room filled with the scent of renewal. That evening, the sky turned golden pink. Margaret sat in her garden, her shawl draped softly around her shoulders. The wind played with her hair as she whispered to the roses, to the sky, to the quiet. She thought about all the years she'd mistaken silence for weakness, and how wrong she'd been. Silence when born of fear is submission. But silence when chosen is strength. She didn't need to yell to reclaim her life. She just needed to stop apologizing for owning it. Love doesn't mean surrender, she thought. Sometimes protecting your peace is the act of love. The moon rose slow and full. She went inside, locking the door not out of fear, but ownership, that soft, secure click of a woman finally at home in her own world. The house glowed faintly in the moonlight, every corner alive with memory and calm. The air held a kind of grace, quiet, earned, unshakable. As she passed the mantel one last time before bed, she paused before her husband's photo, the jasmine perfuming the air around it. "I did it, John," she whispered. "I didn't raise my voice, I raised my worth."